The dust hadn't settled when the screaming began. Across the trampled battlefield outside Aquileia, where Roman banners now lay torn in the mud, Hunnish horsemen moved through the aftermath with practiced efficiency. They weren't looking for survivors to show mercy. They were hunting value. The year was 452, and Attila's forces had just shattered another Roman defense. The general who commanded this doomed legion would never see Rome again. His fate was decided the moment he fell, but his wife, traveling with the army as many elite Roman women did, faced something far more calculated than a clean death. The Huns understood warfare as total domination. For them, victory wasn't complete when the enemy army broke. True conquest happened when you dismantled everything your opponent valued, when you took not just their land, but their dignity, their families, their sense of order in the world. They rode small, hardy horses bred for endurance rather than grandeur. Their composite bows could pierce Roman armor at distances that shocked Mediterranean warriors. But their most devastating weapon was a systematic use of terror, refined over generations of westward migration. When Hun raiders swept through a conquered area, they categorized captives with cold precision. Young men capable of labor were separated immediately. Children were assessed for potential integration or sale. And women, especially those whose clothing and bearing marked them as nobility, were identified for special attention. The general's wife stood in a line of captured Romans as Hunnish warriors walked past, pointing and arguing in their guttural language. She still wore the fine wool stola that marked her status that morning. Now it was torn, dusty, stained with blood that might have been her husband's. Her jewelry had already been stripped away by the first soldiers who grabbed her. Status among Romans meant protection, respect, inviolability. Status among the Huns meant you were worth keeping alive for profit. The woman who woke as a general's wife, accustomed to servants and silk, would sleep that night on hard ground, guarded and counted like livestock. The Hun camps sprawled across the plain, a temporary city of felt tents and cooking fires. Thousands of warriors moved between their quarters, tending horses, sharpening weapons, dividing plunder. The Roman captives were kept in a roped enclosure at the camp's edge, visible to everyone, a display of Hun dominance. For high-status Roman women, the enslavement process began with deliberate humiliation. They were forced to perform menial labor they'd never touched before, hauling water, tending fires, serving food to the warriors who'd killed their protectors. Every task was designed to break the psychological architecture of Roman superiority. But these women also represented negotiating leverage. The Huns had learned that Rome would pay staggering ransoms for its elite. Messages would be sent to the woman's family, if they could be located. Her worth would be calculated in gold solidi, horses, even political concessions. Until payment arrived, if it ever did, she existed in excruciating uncertainty. The ransom system created its own horrors. A woman whose family was wealthy and politically connected might be treated relatively carefully, her value protected like any precious commodity. But a woman whose family had died or lacked resources became worthless except as labor or as an object of crueler purposes. Sexual violence was woven into the fabric of ancient warfare, a weapon wielded to destroy enemy morale and demonstrate absolute power. For Roman women raised in a culture that prized female chastity as family honor, assault represented not just physical violation, but the annihilation of their social identity. The Huns practiced polygamy, and captured women were sometimes forced into marriages with warriors, becoming permanent possessions rather than temporary captives. These unions weren't romantic integrations but property transfers, where the woman's consent was never considered. Her previous life simply erased. Inside the enclosure, the Roman women huddled together at night, whispering in Latin while their captors laughed and drank around distant fires. Some tried to maintain dignity through small rituals, braiding each other's matted hair, sharing scraps of food, reciting prayers to Roman gods who seemed to have abandoned them. One woman, whose husband had commanded cavalry, kept a tiny piece of torn fabric from her wedding veil hidden in her clothing. She would touch it secretly, a material connection to the person she'd been before the battle, before the capture, before her entire world inverted. Resistance took subtle forms. Women would deliberately misunderstand orders, forcing captors to repeat themselves, claiming small moments of defiance. They shared information in whispered conversations, tracking which guards were cruel, which might be bribed, which captives had been taken away and returned, and which never came back. Some formed alliances with other captives, pooling knowledge and resources. A Gallic slave who'd been with the Huns longer might teach survival strategies to the newly captured Romans. Language barriers dissolved in shared suffering, creating underground networks invisible to their captors. The psychological landscape was treacherous. Hope was dangerous because it made each day of continued captivity more agonizing. Despair was equally deadly because it eroded the will to survive long enough for ransom or escape. The women navigated between these extremes, trying to preserve their humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. Months could pass in this liminal existence. Seasons changed. The Hun encampment moved, following Attila's campaigns deeper into Roman territory or back toward the steppes. The captive women traveled with them, walking behind the horse-mounted warriors, their feet bleeding, their faces weathered, their former lives receding into memory. For some, ransom eventually arrived. A family scraped together enough gold, or a political deal was struck that included their release. The journey back to Roman civilization was disorienting, returning to a world that expected them to be who they were before, when everything inside them had fundamentally changed. Others never saw Rome again. They died in captivity from disease, exposure, or violence. They were sold to traders who moved them further east, into territories Romans only knew from maps and rumors. They bore children to Hunnish fathers, and became part of the cultural mixing that characterized this violent period of migration and conquest. The wives of Roman generals left almost no written records. Their voices were filtered through male historians who focused on military campaigns and political consequences, not on the embodied experiences of women trapped between civilizations. What we know comes from fragments, implications, the spaces between documented events. This silence is itself a form of violence, an erasure that continued long after the physical suffering ended. The women who endured Hun captivity became footnotes in histories about Attila's campaigns, their complex realities reduced to brief mentions of captives taken or ransoms paid. Yet their experiences reveal fundamental truths about pre-modern warfare. Gender and status weren't separate from military conflict, but central to it. Attacking enemy women wasn't collateral damage but strategic devastation, targeting the social fabric Romans used to define themselves. The intersection of these identities created unique vulnerabilities. A patrician woman suffered differently than a plebeian, but both suffered in ways male captives didn't. Their bodies became battlegrounds where political, cultural, and gendered violence converged. The Huns eventually receded from history after Attila's death in 453, their confederation dissolving as quickly as it had coalesced. But the trauma they inflicted rippled forward through generations, shaping how Romans understood their own vulnerability, their empire's mortality. These stories matter because they reveal what happens when power becomes absolute and unchecked, when one group gains complete dominion over another. The women who survived Hun captivity carried knowledge we should never forget: that civilization is fragile, that status provides no ultimate protection, that human cruelty has no inherent limits. If you found this exploration valuable, please like this video and subscribe to The Unwritten Wounds for more deep investigations into the hidden traumas of history. These stories need to be told, remembered, and understood.